Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a time of jazz, gin, and questionable life choices. The 1920s, the decade that promised freedom, style, and dancing till sunrise. The one we all romanticize when we look at black and white photos of bob-haired girls sipping champagne with a cigarette dangling at a gravity-defying angle. So, settle in, dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket. Tonight we're imagining what it would actually be like if you woke up one morning and found yourself as a flapper girl in 1925. At first, it sounds glamorous. You picture yourself in that iconic beaded dress. You know, the one that looks like it's permanently mid-shimmy, and you're stepping into a smoky speakeasy while a trumpet wails in the background. But let's be honest, you probably wouldn't make it past lunch before realizing this life was exhausting. Because here's the secret nobody tells you. Flapper life was less champagne and pearls and more endless work, uncomfortable clothes, and trying not to get arrested. First, let's talk about fashion. You've seen the photos. Sleek bob haircut, headband, drop waist dress. Looks comfortable, right? Well, not quite. The bob might look simple, but it required constant upkeep. Women in the 1920s were flocking to barbershops for the first time, and barbers, who had been happily trimming men's hair for centuries, were now annoyed at this sudden invasion. You'd sit in the chair, the barber would sigh, and you'd get a cut that made you look like you'd lost a bet. And if you wanted those neat finger waves, prepare to spend an hour with your head pinned down like a butterfly in a Victorian collection, with someone shaping your hair into tiny ridges using a spoon, some hot irons, and a prayer. And then there's the makeup. Flappers basically invented the smoky eye, dark, kohl-rim lids, and a cupid's bow lip that was supposed to look seductive, but mostly made you look permanently startled. And they were doing all this with early mass-market cosmetics, meaning your eyeliner probably contained enough lead to keep you glowing in the dark. You'd smell faintly of cold cream and carbolic soap, because everyone did. Not exactly glamorous. But the real trouble starts when you leave the house. The 1920s were a strange place for women. Yes, you could vote now. Congratulations. You were politically empowered. But if you showed up wearing a sleeveless dress or showing too much knee, someone's grandmother would scowl at you so hard you'd feel it for a week. Being a flapper wasn't just a fashion statement. It was a social rebellion. You were basically announcing to the world that you drank, smoked, danced, and gasped, sometimes kissed boys before marriage. Society didn't like that. In fact, there were literal city ordinances against hip-wiggling dances. Imagine Charleston and G your way into jail because your knees moved too enthusiastically. Now, let's imagine your first night out. You just spent an hour smearing cold dust on your eyelids, painting your lips into a perfect bow, and shoving your hair under a cloche hat that makes your head look slightly like a mushroom. You head out to a speakeasy, which, by the way, you have to find first, because Prohibition was still a thing. Alcohol was illegal, which meant getting a drink required a secret password, a knock on an unmarked door, and a willingness to share space with gangsters who could definitely smell fear. And the drinks themselves? They weren't exactly artisanal cocktails. Most bootleg liquor was either bathtub gin, yes, literally mixed in a bathtub, or something that might blind you if you weren't careful. You'd choke it down politely while trying not to grimace, because that's what the cool girls did. If you were lucky, there'd be a jazz band playing loudly enough to drown out your coughing. And then the dancing begins. The Charleston looks fun on TikTok, sure, but try doing it for 3 straight hours in shoes that feel like medieval torture devices. Those adorable Mary Janes had about as much arch support as a wooden plank. By midnight, your feet would be screaming and your carefully painted lipstick would be halfway across your face. But let's say you survived the night. Congratulations. Now you have to walk home, because taxis cost money and most flappers were broke. You'd probably be dodging cops on the way, since police were known to raid clubs randomly just to remind everyone that joy was technically illegal. If you got caught, you might spend a night in jail, where your parents would then be called, and you'd spend the next month being compared to your cousin Margaret, who never gave us this kind of trouble. And here's the other secret. Flapper culture wasn't actually for everyone. Most women still stayed home, wore long skirts, and minded their business. The flapper was more of a symbol, the Instagram influencer of her time, representing freedom and modernity. But in reality, She was a very small, very loud subset of society. You'd be more likely to be scolded than admired. Even eating was complicated. Diet culture was already in full swing, and a fashionable flapper was supposed to be boyishly thin. Women were eating lettuce leaves and cigarettes for lunch just to fit into those straight-cut dresses. Not exactly a relaxing lifestyle choice. So by the end of your very first day, you'd probably be exhausted, underfed, and slightly tipsy from bad gin. You'd peel off your dress, kick off your shoes, and wonder how on earth people kept this up every weekend. Let's pause here and imagine it. Would you have lasted longer than a single night? Or would you have crawled back into a long Edwardian skirt and stayed home with a book? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to know how you think you'd have handled the chaos. Let's drift onward, because the 1920s weren't just flapper dresses and jazz. They were also full of social experiments, strange health fads, and some of the most bizarre beauty trends you can imagine. And we'll be wading right into those next. So, we've survived our first exhausting night as a flapper. Your feet are sore, your head hurts, and your dress smells faintly of bathtub gin and cigarette smoke. Naturally, it's time to focus on your health, because nothing says restorative wellness quite like the 1920s. This was a decade when people became obsessed with health, but in that very early 20th century way that was equal parts admirable and ridiculous. For starters, sunbathing was in. For centuries, pale skin had been a mark of aristocracy. Then suddenly Coco Chanel accidentally got a tan on a yacht, and the entire Western world decided bronze skin was chic. Cue everyone rushing outside to lie in the sun for hours without sunscreen, because sunscreen didn't exist yet. If you were unlucky, you'd simply burn, peel, and repeat. A nice crispy lobster look was apparently the price of fashion. And speaking of tanning, if you didn't have the time or weather for it, there were solutions. Some people actually painted on tans with makeup. Others used strange chemical treatments that left them a little more orange than bronze. The original spray tan disasters. You can almost hear someone in 1927 saying, "No, it's supposed to look like that." Then there were the diets. Everyone wanted to be slim enough to look good in those boyish drop-waist dresses. So the 1920s became a paradise for fad diets. Some women swore by the Hollywood diet, which was basically just eating grapefruit before every meal because apparently grapefruit burns fat. Others went for cigarette-based weight loss. Lucky Strike literally ran ads saying, "Reach for a Lucky instead of sweet." That's right. Instead of eating dessert, just start smoking. What could go wrong? Exercise was popular too, but the equipment looked like something from a medieval dungeon. If you walked into a 1920s gym, you'd find vibrating belt machines, giant contraptions where you'd stand while a strap shook your midsection violently, allegedly melting away fat. In reality, you mostly just stood there and looked confused while being jiggled like a bowl of Jell-O. But let's not forget beauty treatments, which range from mildly inconvenient to downright alarming. Permanent waves were all the rage. Finally, curly hair that stayed curly. The process involved sitting under a terrifying contraption of heated rods and wires that made you look like you were auditioning for a Frankenstein movie. The smell of scorched hair would linger for days. Skin care wasn't much better. Cold cream was everywhere. It was like the coconut oil of its day, and women would smear it on their faces every night before bed. If you wanted a facial, some salons offered treatments with radium, because everyone was still convinced radioactivity was good for you. People literally rubbed radioactive lotion on their faces to restore vitality. There were even radioactive bath salts. Nothing says relaxation like a mild glow-in-the-dark effect. Dentistry was equally questionable. Toothpaste came in tins or powder form, and sometimes contained charcoal, which was fine, or formaldehyde, which was less fine. Some people brushed with baking soda, which at least worked, but left your mouth feeling like a science experiment. And if all this left you stressed, there was always Rest Cure. This was a very fashionable treatment for everything from anxiety to general crankiness. The prescription? Lie in bed for weeks. No reading, no writing, just eating milk-soaked bread and staring at the ceiling. This was supposed to make women calm and happy. In reality, it just made them bored and probably a little feral. But here's the fun part. If you were rich enough, you could head to a health spa. These spas were part resort, part pseudoscientific laboratory. You might be wrapped in hot mud, force-fed celery juice, or subjected to electrical stimulation therapy, which was basically someone zapping you with mild currents while assuring you it was good for your nerves. And if you were really adventurous, you might try a reducing salon, where they'd roll your body with strange wooden wheels, rub you down with alcohol, and then send you home convinced you lost 2 pounds of pure evil. You have to admire the commitment. People were willing to try anything for beauty and health, even if it meant possible radiation poisoning or third-degree burns from a curling iron. So, let's imagine you again, our exhausted flapper. You survived a night out, but now you've spent the morning being shaken by a belt machine, had your hair singed into waves, rubbed questionable creams on your face, and smoked 2 lucky strikes in name of not eating dessert. By mid-afternoon, you're probably wondering if any of this is worth it, but then you catch a glimpse of yourself in a shop window. Your bob is perfect, your lips are sharply defined, your knees, slightly scandalous, are peeking out from your dress. People stare, some disapprove, others envy you, and for a brief moment, you feel like you might just be the main character of the entire decade. Would you have tried the radioactive face cream? Or maybe the vibrating belt machine? I'd love to know. Tell me in the comments if you've gone along with these health trends or stayed home with a sensible sandwich instead. Let's drift onward, because the 1920s weren't just about vanity. They were also about scandal, Prohibition-fueled crime, and enough moral panic to keep every newspaper very busy. And that's where we're headed next. So, we've survived our health fads and our radioactive skin treatments. Now we're ready to unwind, and in the 1920s, unwind usually meant alcohol. The only problem? Alcohol was illegal, which was a minor inconvenience for just about everyone, since people were not planning to give up drinking just because the government said so. Prohibition officially began in 1920, after decades of campaigning by the temperance movement, a group mostly made up of church ladies who were convinced alcohol was the root of all evil. In fairness, they weren't entirely wrong. Pre-Prohibition America had a bit of a drinking problem. The average man in the 1800s consumed roughly 3 times as much alcohol as we do today. By the early 20th century, people were ready to see what a sober society might look like. Spoiler, it looked like a society desperately finding loopholes, because almost as soon as the ban was announced, people started breaking it. Enter the speakeasy, those glamorous, secret bars hidden behind unmarked doors or in basements. To get in, you usually needed a password, which made everyone feel like a character in a spy novel. You'd knock. The door would slide open just enough for someone to squint at you suspiciously. And if you passed a vibe check, you'd be let in. Inside, speakeasies were a mixed bag. Some were elegant, with live jazz and chandeliers. Others were basically damp cellars with folding chairs and a barrel of dubious gin. Either way, everyone was drinking something that had been brewed in someone's garage. Bathtub gin was cheap, easy to make, and tasted approximately like cleaning fluid. People mixed it with fruit juice to make it palatable, which is why cocktails like the bee's knees became popular. Not because they were fancy, because they disguised a taste of regret. But of course, this illegal drinking attracted attention, from both the police and from organized crime. Bootleggers made fortunes smuggling booze into cities. Some of them became infamous, like Al Capone, who basically ran Chicago's alcohol trade like it was his personal Etsy shop, except with more machine guns. Gangsters became folk heroes in a strange way. People were fascinated by them. Newspapers covered their lives in breathless detail, and some folks even admired them for sticking it to the government. But make no mistake, it was a violent business. Shootouts were common, and territory wars turned certain neighborhoods into no-go zones. And then there were the raids. Police would occasionally storm a speakeasy to show they were doing their job. Patrons would scatter, drinks would be dumped, and somewhere in the chaos, someone's carefully waved bob would get ruined. Imagine spending 2 hours pinning your hair into finger waves only to have it ruined because an officer tipped your hat off while escorting you outside. But here's the twist. Not everyone was anti-alcohol. In fact, many police officers and politicians were regular speakeasy customers themselves. It was an open secret. Some speakeasies even paid protection money to avoid raids. So, while on paper America was a dry country, in reality it was buzzing with gin and jazz. You just had to know where to look. Drinking at home was another option. People made their own liquor, a practice called home brewing. Some became quite good at it. Others poisoned themselves with bad batches, because methanol contamination was common. If you were really unlucky, you'd end up blind from your cousin's experimental moonshine. So yes, flapper life was dangerous. Even your cocktail might be plotting against you. And then there were the moral reformers, still out there wagging fingers and writing letters to the editor about the downfall of society. Preachers gave fiery sermons about jazz music leading to eternal damnation. Jazz, in their minds, was practically a gateway drug to moral collapse, which probably just made young people love it more. So, imagine yourself again, in your beaded dress, dodging police raids, sipping gin that tastes faintly of nail polish remover, and trying to Charleston without losing your hat. This is your nightlife. Glamorous, yes, but also a constant gamble. Would tonight be smooth sailing, or would you end up sprinting down an alley in heels, clutching your cloche hat and swearing never to drink again? And let's not forget, this wasn't just about alcohol. Speakeasies were places where gender roles loosened a bit. Women and men mingled more freely. Women smoked in public. People danced close together. It was shocking to older generations. For the first time, you could have a drink with a stranger, flirt a little, and enjoy yourself, as long as you were okay with possibly being arrested for it. Prohibition turned the entire country into a game of cat and mouse. People wanted to have fun. The government wanted them to stop. And in the middle, gangsters and bootleggers made a fortune. It was messy, loud, and sometimes dangerous, but gave the 1920s their unique edge. Would you have risked it? Would you have snuck into a speakeasy, or played it safe and stayed home with a cup of tea? Tell me in the comments which side you think you'd be on, the secret gin crowd or the cautious couch club. Let's drift onward, because while we've been focusing on the nightlife, the 1920s also had its fair share of daytime drama. From labor strikes to jazz-crazed moral panics, to the strange obsession with celebrity culture that feels oddly familiar today. We're going to explore that next, slowly, softly, like we're paging through an old photo album together. So, we've survived the speakeasy raids, avoided being accidentally poisoned by gin, and maybe even learned the Charleston without breaking an ankle. Now it's time to talk about something that filled every 1920s newspaper column: celebrities. Because while we think we invented celebrity culture with Instagram, the 1920s were basically running the same playbook, just with more feathers and fewer filters. Hollywood was booming. Before the 1920s, movies were short, grainy novelties. Then suddenly, film became big business. Movie studios turned Los Angeles into a dusty paradise of glamour and drama. Silent film stars became household names: Charlie Chaplin, Gloria Swanson, Clara Bow, Rudolph Valentino, and people obsess over them the same way we do with influencers today. Let's picture it. You are a tired flapper, flipping through a fan magazine in 1925. Every page is covered with photos of impossibly glamorous stars, each one looking like they've never known the misery of bad gin or an uneven finger wave. These magazines told you how to dress, how to do your makeup, even what to think about love. Clara Bow, the original girl, inspired an entire generation to chop their hair and embrace the flapper lifestyle. But fame came with scandals, and the 1920s loved a good scandal. The biggest one of the decade involved Fatty Arbuckle, one of the most famous comedians in the world. He was accused of a crime so shocking that newspapers went wild. It turned into one of the first massive celebrity trials in history. He was acquitted, but the scandal destroyed his career. The public was fascinated, not just by his guilt or innocence, but by the very idea that a celebrity could fall from grace so quickly. Then there was Rudolph Valentino, the Latin lover of silent film. Women swooned over him. Men worried that he was too soft, too romantic. There were editorials about whether he was corrupting masculinity. When he died suddenly at just 31, thousands of fans showed up to his funeral. Some even reportedly fainted in the streets. It was the 1920s version of a Twitter meltdown. And of course, there were plenty of smaller scandals. Divorces, affairs, drunken parties. The tabloids covered them relentlessly. Hollywood tried to rein things in with the creation of the Hays Code, a set of moral guidelines for movies, but that was later in the decade. Before then, it was chaos. Movie stars threw wild parties, posed for risque photos, and set trends that shocked traditionalists. It wasn't just actors, though. Sports heroes were also national celebrities. Babe Ruth turned baseball into a spectacle, hitting home runs like no one had before. People packed stadiums to watch him play. Newspapers printed his every word. He wasn't just an athlete, he was a walking headline. And then there were the writers and intellectuals, Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda, throwing glamorous, chaotic parties that made everyone want to be just a little bit reckless. Fitzgerald himself called the 1920s a jazz age, and while he spent a lot of time romanticizing it, he also quietly admitted that it was all a little hollow. Celebrity culture in the 1920s wasn't just about admiration. It was also about aspiration. Ordinary people began trying to copy the glamorous lives they saw in magazines and on the screen. Department stores sold Claire about lipstick shades. Women bought dresses that looked like they belonged in a movie. People decorated their homes in the sleek, modern Art Deco style because it made them feel like they were part of this dazzling, modern world. And yet, for all the glamour, celebrity life could be rough. The studios owned their stars. Literally, they told them what to wear, who to date, even what scandals they were allowed to have. If you stepped out of line, you might find yourself mysteriously blacklisted. It was a strange mix of freedom and control. The public saw freedom, but the reality was carefully stage-managed. Would you have been one of those people waiting outside a theater to catch a glimpse of your favorite star? Or maybe writing angry letters to the paper about the moral corruption of jazz-age celebrities? It's an oddly timeless question. We're still doing the same thing today, just on different platforms. Tell me in the comments whether you think you'd have been a swooning fan or a cautious critic. Let's drift onward. Because while Hollywood was dazzling, the world outside was shifting too. The 1920s were a decade of huge economic change, wild new inventions, and a growing sense that the future had finally arrived. Let's take a slow walk into that future, from radios to refrigerators and all the ways technology was quietly rewriting daily life. We've lingered in the glow of Hollywood lights long enough. Now, let's drift back into something quieter, everyday life. Because while the 1920s are remembered for flappers, gangsters, and jazz, most of the decade was spent doing very normal, very human things. Eating breakfast, going to work, complaining about the neighbors. And thanks to a wave of new inventions, ordinary life was starting to look suspiciously modern. Step into a middle-class home in 1925, and you'll notice something new humming softly in the corner, the radio. It was the decade's most transformative invention. Families would gather around it every evening, listening to music, comedy shows, sports broadcasts, or President Coolidge speaking in a voice that probably sounded as enthusiastic as a piece of bread. The radio made the world feel smaller. Suddenly, you could hear a boxing match happening hundreds of miles away, or listen to jazz without sneaking into a speakeasy. Then there were refrigerators, or at least early versions of them. Before the 1920s, keeping food cold meant relying on big blocks of ice delivered by the iceman. By the mid-20s, electric refrigerators were showing up in more and more homes, buzzing faintly and making housewives feel like they had stepped into the future. Imagine being able to keep milk fresh for days instead of hours. Revolutionary. Kitchens were becoming the center of the home, thanks to companies like General Electric and Westinghouse selling appliances with gleaming chrome finishes. Toasters, electric irons, and vacuum cleaners were suddenly within reach of middle-class families. Of course, not everyone could afford them. So many people just kept sweeping with brooms and pretending not to be jealous of their neighbor's fancy new Hoover. Phones were becoming common too, though not every home had one. If you want to call someone, you'd pick up the receiver, wait for the operator, and hope no one on your party line was already gossiping. Privacy was optional. Your entire neighborhood might hear about your doctor's appointment before you even hung up. Transportation was changing just as quickly. Cars were becoming affordable thanks to Henry Ford and his Model T. Suddenly, you could go places on a whim. drive to the city, visit relatives, escape your small town for an evening, all without relying on trains. Roads were still dusty, sometimes barely paved, so you'd arrive covered in a thin layer of dirt, but the freedom was intoxicating. And then there was the fashion of the home itself. Interior design was embracing modernism, gone were the heavy Victorian drapes and ornate furniture. In came clean lines, geometric patterns, and shiny metal fixtures. Art Deco became the style of the age, sleek, streamlined, and a little bit glamorous. Even if you didn't live like a flapper, you could sit in a room that looked like one might walk through at any moment. Leisure was evolving, too. People played records on gramophones, danced in their living rooms, or played board games like mahjong, which became wildly popular for reasons no one entirely understands. Young people began to expect more fun in their lives. Dating became more casual, with couples go to movies or taking long drives rather than sitting stiffly in parlors under parental supervision. But for all this modernity, daily life could still be exhausting. Housework was lighter with new appliances, but it was still endless. Laundry meant hauling clothes through tubs of water, scrubbing, wringing, and hanging them to dry. Food still had to be cooked from scratch. Shopping meant daily trips, since supermarkets weren't widespread yet. And depending on where you lived, indoor plumbing was still a luxury. The glamour of the jazz age often stopped at the bathroom door. Work life was shifting too. The economy was booming, so more people had disposable income. Office jobs were becoming common, and women were joining the workforce in larger numbers as secretaries, teachers, telephone operators. Some even became journalists, advertising executives, or pilots, but those were still the exceptions. Most women were expected to leave work when they married, which sounds romantic until you realize it meant financial dependence on a husband who might or might not have been great with money. And speaking of money, credit was becoming easier to get. Stores offered installment plans, so you could buy that radio now and pay for it later. This was new and exciting. It also meant that by the end of the decade, many people were in over their heads financially. But for now, in the mid-20s, it just felt like life was expanding. So imagine yourself there again. You wake up in a home that smells faintly of coffee and coal smoke. You turn on the radio and hear Louis Armstrong's trumpet coming through the static. You eat a breakfast of cornflakes, which were still a relatively new idea, and then you hop in a car that smells faintly of gasoline to drive somewhere just for fun. It feels like the future has arrived, and maybe for the first time in history, ordinary people can taste a little luxury. Would you have been an early adopter, the first on your block with a refrigerator and a radio, or would you have waited, suspicious of newfangled gadgets? Tell me in the comments. I wonder how many of us would have been brave enough to let a machine vibrate our toast every morning. Let's drift onward, because even though the world was buzzing with modernity, the 1920s were not without their shadows. For all the fun, there were strikes, racial tensions, political scandals, and a creeping sense that not everyone was invited to the party. We'll wander into that next, slowly, carefully, like we're turning over a page that might still be smudged with history. We've been floating to the glittering world of radios, shiny toasters, and jazz-soaked evenings. But let's be honest, the 1920s were not all cocktail parties and Charleston contests. For many people, this was a hard decade, a stressful one, a decade where the world was changing faster than they could keep up, and not everyone was invited to dance. Start with work. Yes, the economy was booming, but that didn't mean everyone was rolling in money. Industrial jobs were still grueling. Coal miners, steel workers, textile laborers, they all spent long days in dangerous conditions for very little pay. And when they tried to strike for better wages or safer workplaces, things often turned ugly. The early 1920s saw some massive labor strikes that were met with police crackdowns, strikebreakers, and occasionally the National Guard. It's hard to feel like the jazz age is sparkling when you're walking a picket line and dodging tear gas. Farmers had it rough, too. During World War I, agriculture boomed because Europe needed food. Farmers bought new tractors, expanded their land, and took on debt. Then the war ended, demand collapsed, and suddenly farmers were drowning in debt with no way out. Many lost their farms. Some packed up and headed to the cities, hoping factory work would save them. The roaring part of the decade never quite reached rural areas. And then there were the racial tensions. The Great Migration, the mass movement of African Americans from the rural South to northern cities, was in full swing. People were seeking better jobs and escaping the Jim Crow laws of the South. But arriving in northern cities didn't always mean a warm welcome. Competition for jobs led to racial clashes. The early 1920s saw a disturbing number of race riots, often sparked by small incidents but fueled by deep social resentment. The Ku Klux Klan also made a comeback during this decade, not just in the South, but nationwide. They held massive rallies, burned crosses, and terrorized not only Black Americans, but also Catholics, Jews, and immigrants. Imagine living in a small town where your neighbor might suddenly show up in a white hood. It was a chilling counterpoint to the decade's talk of freedom and progress. Immigrants faced their own struggles. The 1920s saw strict new immigration laws, designed to limit arrival from Southern and Eastern Europe. Politicians spoke openly about protecting American culture, which was really just code for keeping certain groups out. Ellis Island, which had once been a symbol of opportunity, became a place of tighter inspections and more rejections. And then there were women. Yes, they had just gotten the vote. Yes, the flapper was out there drinking gin and dancing to Charleston. But most women were still expected to marry young, keep house, and raise children. If you were a working-class woman, you probably didn't have time for speakeasies. You were too busy sewing, scrubbing, or taking in laundry to help make ends meet. The glamorous flapper was really a middle-class fantasy, not a universal reality. Even in the cities, there was a constant undercurrent of moral panic. Every time young people pushed a boundary, shorter skirts, jazz music, public dancing, newspapers ran anxious editorials about the collapse of civilization. Preachers warned that the world was going straight to ruin, one Charleston at a time. It's a little funny now, imagining someone standing in a pulpit yelling about the moral dangers of syncopated music, but at the time it was taken very seriously. So, imagine yourself again, our tired flapper. Maybe this time you're reading the newspaper and realizing that while you were out dancing, the rest of the country is in turmoil. Strikes, riots, political scandals. The world feels unsettled, like it's speeding ahead too fast. You might start to feel that strange tension under the sparkle, that this party can't last forever. Would you have been the one trying to keep the peace, or would you have joined a protest march? Would you have supported the new social freedoms, or worried about where all this change was heading? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to know whether you think you'd be an agitator, an observer, or someone just trying to get through the week. Let's drift onward, because the decade wasn't done throwing surprises. After all, no story of the 1920s would be complete without looking at its obsession with fads and novelty. Everything from marathon dances to flagpole sitting, because apparently people in the 20s were just really bored and had too much energy. Now that we've seen the gloomier edges of the decade, let's loosen up a little. The 1920s were an age of restless energy. People had just come out of a devastating war and a deadly pandemic. There was a strange need to do something. Anything to feel alive again, so they invented fads. Many, many fads. Some of them charming, some of them ridiculous, and some that make you wonder if everyone was just slightly unwell from breathing too much cigarette smoke. Take marathon dancing. Yes, that was exactly what it sounds like, dancing for as long as you possibly could. Contestants paired up, got on the dance floor, and just kept going, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. The rules usually allowed you to sort of shuffle in place if you were too tired to actually dance. People fainted. People collapsed. The audience loved it. It was considered entertainment to watch strangers slowly break down physically and emotionally under the glare of a spotlight. In a way, it was the original reality TV, only with more sweat and fewer commercials. Then there was flagpole sitting. This was the art, if you can call it that, of climbing up a flagpole and sitting on top of it for as long as possible. People would perch up there for hours, days, even weeks. They brought up food in baskets. Sometimes they slept sitting up. Crowds gathered below to cheer them on or just stare in disbelief. Nobody is quite sure why this became so popular, but the first man to try it, a stuntman named Alvin Shipwreck Kelly supposedly did it on a dare. Naturally, the public decided this was the best idea they'd ever heard, and soon there were flagpole sitters across the country. If sitting on top of a pole wasn't thrilling enough, there were also goldfish swallowing contests. Exactly what they sound like. Someone would swallow a live goldfish, then another, until everyone around was equal parts horrified and impressed. This particular fad would get even bigger in the 1930s. But the 1920s laid the groundwork by proving that Americans will turn literally anything into a competition. Games got wilder too. Mahjong swept the country, with middle-class Americans buying sets and learning the game in living rooms. Crossword puzzles became a national craze, with newspapers scrambling to publish them as fast as possible. People became so obsessed with solving them that one paper begged readers to stop writing and complain when they couldn't figure out the clues. And of course, there was a Charleston. The dance itself became so popular that entire schools opened just to teach people how to do it without injuring themselves. It was wild, high energy, and slightly chaotic, which made it perfect for the decade. There were also other dances, each sillier than the last, like the black bottom and the shimmy. If you could wiggle to music, chances are someone was doing it in a crowded club somewhere. Fashion fads were everywhere too. Cloche hats were the must-have accessory. Bobbed haircuts shocked older generations, who worried that cutting off all the hair might somehow also cut off a woman's morality. Men's fashion got slimmer, slicker, with suspenders and bow ties making a big comeback. And then there was makeup, something women before the 1920s had been warned against. Lipstick, rouge, and kohl eyeliner became everyday items. The result was a generation that, for the first time, treated makeup as a symbol of freedom rather than scandal. But for all this fun, there was still that hint of exhaustion underneath. These fads, for all their excitement, were often just distractions from how unstable life still felt. People danced for days maybe because it was easier than thinking about the next economic downturn. They climbed flagpoles because it was the only way to feel above it all, literally. Picture yourself there. The jazz band is still playing. Your feet are sore from dancing, but you're not ready to go home yet. There's a crowd outside cheering for someone on a flagpole, and you're thinking maybe you'll try it next weekend. Because why not? The world seems absurd anyway. Would you have joined a dance marathon just to see how far you could go? Or would you have been the one in the crowd, watching, amused, but secretly relieved you didn't have to shuffle through 3 straight days of foxtrots? Tell me in the comments. I'm curious which one sounds more like you. Let's drift a little further, because the 1920s weren't just about fads. They were also about technology that reshaped everything. Cars, radios, movies. So, let's quietly roll into that next part and see how the decade turned us all into early adopters of modern life. Let's settle into this next stretch of history by imagining the sound of a distant car horn, because if there was one thing that truly defined the 1920s, it was the automobile. The car wasn't just a vehicle, it was a cultural earthquake. Henry Ford's Model T had already been around for a while, but in the 1920s, production exploded. Ford's assembly line made cars cheap enough that middle-class families could actually buy them. And once you had a car, suddenly the world felt a little bigger. Picture it. You could leave your house, drive to the next town over, and come back in the same day. No train schedule, no horse to saddle. For young people, this was freedom. It was a chance to escape the watchful eyes of parents and neighbors, which is probably why the car quickly became associated with dating, privacy, and, well, let's just say, unsupervised courtship. This was the decade when the phrase backseat romance first started raising eyebrows. Road trips became a thing. Families packed up the Model T and drove out to see the countryside, often on roads that were barely paved and filled with dust. Gas stations started popping up everywhere, along with roadside diners and tourist cabins. The ancestors of the modern motel. Car culture was born, and it hasn't left us since. Then there was the radio. Before the 1920s, entertainment was mostly live. Concerts, plays, vaudeville shows. Suddenly, you could sit in your living room and hear a concert broadcast from hundreds of miles away. News traveled instantly. The president could address the nation in real time. For many people, it felt almost magical, like voices were traveling through the air straight into their homes. Families would gather around the radio in the evenings to listen together. It was the first time mass media created a shared experience for millions of people at once. Everyone heard the same music, the same sports commentary, the same serialized dramas. It also meant that advertisers had a captive audience. So yes, the age of radio was also the age of the first annoying jingles. Cinema was the other great invention of this cultural moment. The 1920s were the golden age of silent film. Stars like Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, and Clara Bow became international icons. Movie palaces, ornate, chandelier-filled theaters, sprang up in cities across America. For a few cents, you could sit in a plush seat, watch the newsreel, and then escape into a glamorous story on the screen. And then came the talkies. In 1927, The Jazz Singer premiered, and suddenly silent film looked old-fashioned. The audience heard Al Jolson speak on screen. You ain't heard nothing yet, and they hadn't. Within a few years, every studio had switched to sound. It was revolutionary, but it also ended a lot of careers. Silent film stars with voices that didn't match their glamorous image suddenly found themselves out of work. Technology was reshaping daily life in smaller ways, too. Refrigerators started appearing in middle-class homes, replacing the old icebox. Washing machines and vacuum cleaners became more common, making housework slightly less exhausting, though women were still expected to do all of it, so maybe easier is relative. Electric lights became standard in more houses, stretching the day longer and longer. There was something both exciting and unsettling about how fast everything was changing. Imagine you are there. You just come back from your first trip to the cinema, still thinking about the glittering world you saw on the screen. You step into your kitchen, where a new electric toaster sits on the counter, ready to burn your breakfast evenly for the first time in history. Outside, the sound of a car engine hums softly as someone drives past. It must have felt like the future was arriving piece by piece, every single day. Would you have embraced all this technology? Or would you have been suspicious, the kind of person who worried that radio waves might scramble your thoughts? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to know if you think you'd be an early adopter or someone hanging on to their horse and buggy as long as possible. Let's float onward, because we're approaching the part of the story where the party starts to wobble a little. The prosperity of the 1920s had its limits, and by the end of the decade, the glitter was wearing thin. The next part will take us right up to the edge of the Great Depression, where the music slows down and the lights start to dim. So far, we've been wandering to the decade like guests at a very long party, drinking in the music, the fashions, the machines, the fads. But like any party that goes on too long, there comes a point where you notice the ashtrays are overflowing, the floor is sticky, and someone is asleep on the sofa in an odd position. The 1920s were no different. By the second half of the decade, little cracks were starting to show beneath all that sparkle. Economically, the country seemed unstoppable, at least on surface. Industry was booming. Cars were rolling off assembly lines. Radios were selling by the millions. Stock prices soared. People bought shares in companies with money they didn't actually have because banks were happy to lend it. The phrase buying on margin became common, meaning you could put down just a fraction of the money and borrow the rest, betting that the stock would go up. And for a while it worked. People made money fast. Some ordinary workers even started investing, convinced that the market could only go one direction, up. Newspapers ran glowing stories about millionaires who had gotten rich overnight. It all felt unstoppable, too good to be true, which, of course, it was. Farmers, meanwhile, were still struggling. They hadn't recovered from the post-war collapse in prices, and many were drowning in debt. But because most of the country lived in cities now, their pain didn't make the front pages. It was a warning sign few people wanted to look at too closely. And then there were all those new gadgets. For the first time, people were buying things on credit, refrigerators, radios, cars, and promising to pay for them later. Installment plans became a way of life. The trouble was, if you lost your job, you also lost the ability to make payments. The economy was being built on a very delicate balance, like stacking champagne glasses at a wedding. Beautiful to look at, But one wrong move could send it all crashing down. Socially, too, there was a sense that things were changing faster than people could quite handle. The youth of the decade seemed wilder than ever, not just drinking and dancing, but questioning old ideas about marriage, religion, and authority. Older generations worried that the country was losing its moral center. Ministers preached against jazz. Politicians tried to enforce prohibition harder. Nobody really succeeded. And then there was crime. Organized crime had grown fat on bootlegging. Figures like Al Capone were practically household names by the late 1920s. Gang violence became so common in Chicago that the city earned reputation as the murder capital. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, when 7 men were gunned down in a garage, shocked the nation. It was a reminder that all those glamorous speakeasies were connected to something darker. The sense of overconfidence mixed with unease grew stronger as the decade wore on. Imagine standing in 1928, watching ticker tape flutter down from tall buildings during a parade. Everyone around you is smiling, confident, sure that the future is bright. The music is still playing. The party hasn't stopped. Yet. But if you were paying close attention, you might notice the waiter carrying the bill toward the table. The market was getting overheated. Prices were rising faster than profits. People were borrowing too much. All it would take was a little panic to send the whole thing into freefall. Would you have seen the warning signs? Or would you have joined the rush, buying shares in any company that sounded exciting because everyone else was doing it? Tell me in the comments. I wonder if you'd have been cautious or if you had taken a wild chance on a booming market. Let's drift a little further because we are now heading for the inevitable moment, the stock market crash. Don't worry, we'll keep it soft and calm, even as things fall apart. Here we are, standing at the edge of October 1929. The markets are still climbing, but there's a faint tension in the air. Imagine walking through Wall Street. Brokers shouting, phones ringing, ticker tape machines rattling as they print endless strings of numbers. At first, it all feels like business as usual. But beneath the noise, something is shifting. The stock market had been rising almost non-stop for years. People thought it would never stop. But in September and early October, prices started dipping. Nothing too dramatic, just enough to make people a little nervous. And then came October 24th, a day that would later be called Black Thursday. That morning, prices began to plummet. Investors rushed to sell, but there weren't enough buyers. The ticker tape machines fell hours behind because so many trades were happening at once. Rumors spread that the market was collapsing entirely. Crowds gathered outside the New York Stock Exchange just to watch the chaos, standing silently as men ran back and forth inside, their faces drawn and pale. Big bankers tried to calm things down. They pooled millions of dollars to buy stocks and stop the freefall. For a moment, it worked. Prices steadied, but the relief didn't last long. The following Monday, the panic came roaring back. And then came Tuesday, October 29th, Black Tuesday. That day, the market fell harder and faster than ever before. Billions of dollars in value vanished in hours. People who had been wealthy on paper suddenly had nothing. Some investors lost their life savings in a single morning. Office clerks fainted. Runners wept. The floor of the stock exchange looked like a storm had hit it. Paper everywhere, voices shouting, a feeling that the world was tilting underfoot. And just like that, the 1920s were over. The jazz age, the flapper decade, the era of sparkling champagne and flagpole-sitting contests, all seemed to vanish overnight. But here's something to remember. The crash didn't cause a Great Depression all by itself. It was a trigger, yes, but the economy had been fragile for years. Too much debt, too much speculation, too much faith that the good times would never end. The crash simply pulled the curtain back all at once, leaving everyone blinking in the harsh light. The effect spread quickly. Banks failed as people rushed to withdraw their money. Businesses closed because they couldn't get credit. Factories laid off workers. Within months, unemployment soared. Soup kitchens appeared in cities. The word prosperity suddenly sounded like a bad joke. Imagine you are there, standing on a street corner in late 1929. The music from the speakeasies has gone quiet. The store windows seem a little emptier. People walk past with worried faces. There's a sense that something big has ended, and nobody quite knows what comes next. Would you have tried to stay cheerful, insisting that things would bounce back? Or would you have been one of the first to pull your money out, hide it under your mattress, and wait for the storm to pass? Tell me in the comments. It's fascinating to think about what we would have done in that moment. Let's drift onward now into the early 1930s to see how this crash reshaped daily life. The flapper dresses were packed away, the flagpoles empty, the jazz a little quieter. The next part is about what it felt like when the lights went out on the party, and everyone had to find a way to keep going. The party was over. The glittering chandeliers of the jazz age had gone dark, and in their place came a long, gray dawn. The early 1930s were not dramatic in a fiery, chaotic way. They were slow, heavy, like walking through a fog that didn't lift. People woke up one morning and found that their savings were gone. The banks had closed. The little nest egg they had been keeping was just not there anymore. For many, this was the first time they felt truly powerless. Imagine stepping into a bank you had trusted for years, only to find the doors locked and a handwritten note taped to the glass. Bank closed. No explanation. No one inside. Just silence. Unemployment rose like a tide, quietly, steadily. Factories shut down because nobody could afford to buy what they were making. Shops closed because customers stopped coming. If you were lucky enough to keep your job, chances are your wages were cut. If you weren't, you stood in line for hours to get a bowl of soup from a charity kitchen. Those shiny Model T cars, the pride of the last decade, were suddenly parked for good because families couldn't afford gas. People began walking again or hitching rides on trains when they could. Farmers who had been on the edge for years finally lost their land. Entire families piled what little they owned into wagons or trucks and moved, hoping to find work somewhere else. The mood changed. People who'd been buying new radios and fashionable hats just a year or two earlier now patched their clothes, stretched their meals, and learned to make do with less. Frivolity felt inappropriate, almost shameful. Jazz still played on the radio, but it sounded different now. Softer, more melancholy. The endless energy of the Charleston was replaced with slower dances, quieter nights. And yet, life went on. People adapted. Families planted gardens in empty lots, sharing what they grew. Neighbors helped each other when they could. Children found ways to play games with nothing but sticks, chalk, or tin cans. There was a kind of stubborn dignity in simply carrying on. Popular culture shifted too. The movies of the early 1930s became a place of escape. Sparkling musicals where everyone wore tuxedos and tap danced through perfect Art Deco sets. Audiences went to forget their troubles for a few hours, to sit in the dark and watch a version of life that was still glamorous, still full of hope. Prohibition ended in 1933, partly because the government realized it needed the tax revenue from legal alcohol. That moment was like a small sigh of relief. People lined up at breweries and bars, ready to toast to better days. But it didn't magically solve the economic crisis. The road back was going to be long. Imagine yourself there. Maybe you are standing in line for bread, holding your coat closed against the wind. Maybe you are listening to the radio in a quiet living room, the static humming softly as the president gives a speech promising that better days are coming. You might not believe him yet, but you want to. Would you have been the practical type, planting vegetables and rationing carefully? Or would you have been one of the escapists, spending your last few cents on a movie ticket just to sit in the dark and dream for a while? Tell me in the comments. It's always fascinating to think about how we would have coped. Let's drift just a little further, because we have one last part to go, a gentle reflection on what the 1920s really meant, why they still capture our imagination, and what we might learn from them as we close this sleepy journey. And now, here we are at the end of the decade, and at the end of our long, slow journey together. The 1920s are behind us, the champagne bottles empty, the music finally quiet. The world is sitting in the early years of the Depression, looking back on the wild party with a mixture of nostalgia and disbelief. It's strange, isn't it, how short the Roaring Twenties really were. Just a single decade, barely 10 years, and yet they changed so much. The way people dressed, the way they danced, the way they fell in love, the way they thought about freedom. The decade was messy, contradictory, beautiful, and flawed, much like the people who lived through it. When we look back now, we tend to remember the sparkle, the flappers, the jazz, the cars, the Art Deco glamour. But underneath was a generation trying to recover from a world war and a pandemic, trying to feel alive again after so much death. Maybe that's why the decade burned so brightly. Because everyone knew in some quiet corner of their mind that the good times might not last. The 1920s gave us new technologies that still shape us today. Mass media, affordable cars, advertising that told us what we should want before we knew we wanted it. It also gave us cautionary tales about speculation, about inequality, about what happens when we ignore warning signs. But it also gave us music, laughter, cocktails, and a new sense of freedom. The flapper wasn't just a pretty image in a beaded dress. She was a symbol that the world could change, that women could claim space, could dance, could smoke, could vote. The car wasn't just a hunk of metal. It was the first taste of independence for millions of people. The radio wasn't just a box with wires. It was a sound of connection, of a country hearing itself speak all at once. So imagine one last time that you are there. It is the end of 1929. The music is quieted, but you are still standing in your sequin dress or your well-worn suit, watching the lights flicker in the distance. You've lived through a decade of dizzying change, and now the future is a blank page. Maybe you feel tired, but also a little wiser. Would you miss the party, or would you feel secretly relieved that it was over? Would you be ready to settle into quieter years, or would you long for one more night of jazz, one more glass of champagne, one more spin across the dance floor? Tell me in the comments. It's the perfect place to reflect. And as we bring this long, drowsy story to a close, I want to thank you for drifting through the 1920s with me tonight. If you found yourself feeling a little calmer, a little sleepier, or just a little more thoughtful about this strange, glittering decade, I'd love for you to like this video, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe so we can wander through more sleepy stories together. And here's a final question to leave you with as you drift off. If you could bring back one thing from the 1920s, a style, a song, a gadget, even a dance, what would it be? Let me know in the comments, and maybe we'll meet again in another decade next time. Sleep well and good night.